Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of our conference. The first speaker of the afternoon will be Faye Corthésy from the University of Lausanne. She has conducted her PhD research on exactly the topics of this conference. And I invite Faye to join me because otherwise we won't be able to have her paper recorded. Stay there 1 second. Sit down.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Because I have to do another little trick. And then you move to my chair and I go to your chair, you know. Looks like slapstick comedy, but actually it's the only way we have to do the recording and share your PowerPoint. Okay, so Faye Corthésy will present a paper titled Beyond the United States, New American Cinema's Multiplicity of Sites in the 1960s. Then this is not your PowerPoint. Perfect. Okay. Okay. Your PowerPoint is called Ron because I titled it Ron. Okay. But we live in a fluid world, you know, identities are always endlessly changing. So, but this is your PowerPoint. Yes. Okay. You're very welcome. Okay. Do you want full screen? Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Giaime, and thank you also, Ron, Sabrina, and yeah, especially Giaime for organizing all this and being so welcoming. And yeah, thank you also for the talks and the film this morning. It was very moving for me to see that interview with Mekas in the 90s, because I've met him through my research and spent quite a lot of time with him, and somehow it was, yeah, very beautiful, and also to hear Julia talk about him. So yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna start. And as Giaime said, this paper is part of research of mine that I should finish soon, that focuses on the history of the New American Cinema Group in the 60s. So the group you already heard about that was founded in New York in 1960 by Jonas Mekas, among others. And it's that group that most notably established the Filmmakers Cooperative in 1962 as one of its divisions, and that still is an alternative distribution center in New York. And the now focus of my research is on the transnational connections of the group and on the circulation of the works associated with New American cinema outside of the United States in the 60s. To put it briefly, if New American cinema has been chiefly situated by film historians in a North American context, I argue that it became an American movement, or that its nationality was constructed, and that it came to play a central role in the historiographical narrative of avant-garde and experimental cinema through the circulation of films, of discourses associated with the phrase New American cinema outside of the United States. So in my research, I focus on displacement in its very concrete meaning related to the movement and traveling of films, of discourses, and of people that altogether worked to construct a or maybe several New American cinemas. And what these diverse circulations create and forbid is what interests me. And I also wish to perform a sort of displacement from dominant historiographical discourse approaching New American cinema from outside the US. And I argue that this topographical displacement brings forth a perspective that is not peripheral and accessory, it's like a new footnote to what we already know, but actually central and crucial to an understanding of the impact of New American cinema until today. So why would the national scale or even a local one, New York City, not be the best perspective to study New American cinema and the group? And I know that I don't need to convince all of you here that the transnational perspective is a relevant one, but it's true that it might sound counterintuitive to say that New American cinema was mainly constructed outside the US. The group was founded in New York, so was the cooperative. There's even a national affirmation in the name of the group itself, the New American Cinema Group. And the members were mostly living in the US, if not were American, and their films made there. And in the first statement of the New American Cinema Group, published in '61 and written in 1960, they put forward the need to change the national film production system and film culture. So this focus on the transnational was, in fact, not a sort of a priori hypothesis of mine, but something that became conspicuous during my archival research. This first statement already opens up the national scale by expressing a solidarity with other new cinema movements in the world, as well as by mentioning the circulation or non-circulation of films across borders. And let me share some evidence of the circulation of films, discourses, and persons related to New American cinema in the long 60s in order to outline this more mobile historical narrative that I'm focusing on. First, translations of the first statement of the group were published very early on, and sometimes at the same time as the American publication in several magazines or anthologies in Europe, including in Italy. And jumping across the decade, when looking for the first monographs published on New American cinema or featuring prominently New American cinema, one finds not only the nowadays classical texts by Sheldon Rennan or P. Adams Sidney that were published in the US, but also Italian monographs that have had a much more maybe limited reach than visionary film, than visionary film, sorry. It's New American Cinema by Renato Tomasino in '70 and Occhio Mio Dio by Alfredo Leonardi in '71. And I've put with them also two translations of Metaphors and Vision that we heard about in the talk this morning, and of a moving picture giving and taking book by Brakhage in Italy and in Sweden around the same time. This literature production in Europe simultaneously as in the US can be explained by the circulation of films, of filmmakers and critics, and of discourses throughout the 60s, and in Italy and Sweden, among others. And this was initiated and encouraged directly by the group that built its own network for the circulation of films, mainly outside classical networks such as the film festivals circuit. Indeed, the first large program of films gathered under the umbrella of New American Cinema took place not in New York or the US, but in Europe, in the Italian city of Spoleto in summer '61, as part of the Festival of Two Worlds, and the two worlds are the US and Europe. And you'll hear more about it in Run's paper. And this program is at the origin of a series of so-called traveling exhibitions of New American cinema organized by the group 3 times in the 60s in Europe and in South America. And they were named exhibitions or expositions, but they were film programs. So A first program traveled in Europe in 64, then in South America in 65. It didn't really travel there because of some issues, so there was only a program that took place in Buenos Aires. And finally in Europe again in 67, 68 for a longer period of time, and that's when this big film program took place here in Torino, and we'll hear more about it with Giaime's paper. So these were organized on a low budget and sometimes partially on the spot, and were presented in different kinds of institutions such as cinematheques, film societies, film schools and universities, art centers, or even private spaces such as hotel rooms or apartments. And on the three occasions, they were accompanied by a then very young film critic acquainted with Mekes, whose name you know, it's P. Adams Sidney, who has the same look when he had the same look at 19 today, basically. Occasionally with someone else, so Barbara Rubin, Barbara Stone, Jonas Mekes all joined him at some point or another. And here's a photomontage made by P. Adam Sidney himself, picturing himself wearing a Vatican hat and saying a wrongly spelled ciao, which also tells a lot about transnationalism and language. And that's in a letter that he wrote during the first two in 64. So the documents, it's like the new Pope. The documents that I could collect so far on these screenings tours can be used to reconstruct the plurality of New American cinema sites in the 60s, and thus challenge a reductive narrative that confines it to the US national borders. And of course, the reconstruction of each and every context where screenings took place is not something I can do and will do all by myself. It's a gigantic work, and I know that some of you here are working on researching the micro-histories of New American cinema's reception in the 60s, and we'll hear more about it later in the afternoon. So what I'd like to do now is sort of take a step back and ask, what's the point of doing that? What can we learn from situating New American cinema beyond the US? So historical analysis of these traveling exhibitions requires the historian to deal with a variety of sites across national borders, but it also challenges a perspective that is still prevalent in the studies on experimental or avant-garde films, with great exceptions. The focus on filmic texts belonging to their authors and or to their national and historical production origins. In this latter perspective, description and close analysis of a corpus of films lie at the center of the researcher's work. Instead, in exploring the remains of the traveling exhibitions, I argue for a historical approach that shines a light not on films as stable texts, but that follows the circulation of film copies accompanied by people and discourses. So my interest is not on films per se, but on particular events, specific film screenings and talks that were part of larger programs. So critical in this perspective is not what the films are or convey, but what they did as agents and what kind of arrangement was set up with them. And this, I contend, can help us write a new historical narrative of New American cinema in several ways that I'd like to briefly introduce. First, it can help us understand the formation of a canon by focusing on film programs. So you might know that the filmmakers' cooperative's modus operandi in the 60s was very open. The co-op, and it's not the case anymore today, but accepted each work submitted to its catalog and did not wish to put forward any work or filmmaker over the other in the actual paper catalog that was distributed and available to universities, museums, and people that were interested in screening some films. And what happens with the traveling exhibitions and the programs organized in the same decade is different, because a certain number of films are selected by two persons, Jonas Mekas and P. Adam Sidney, and sometimes discussed with the host, that are deemed representative of a movement. So the non-selective principle of the co-op is not valid anymore with the traveling exhibition. And what we observe instead is a process of selection that involves the taste and judgment of individuals. And here I can give an example of this selection process, sorry. So on the right is a list of films in the catalogue of the Filmmakers Cooperative in '65. And on the left, on the left and on the right is the list of films shown in Buenos Aires in the summer on that same year. And on one side, we have approximately 360 films, and on the other, 46 films. And this, of course, is already a lot. In this regard, we could say that the New American Cinema Group itself worked or participated in building the canon of New American cinema films, meaning by that the selection of works that would become emblematic of the movement by allowing a selection of works to circulate and be seen abroad. So we could say that this process of selection does not start in 69, 70 with the creation of anthology film archives and of the infamous Essential Cinema program. A second point I'd like to mention is that looking at this specific screening can also help us retrace, to a certain extent, the historical life of films. In his study on the restoration of artists' films, and his examples include films from the 60s, film scholar Enrico Camporesi devotes a chapter to the site and the event, where he argues for the necessity when restoring artists' films that sometimes have a real performative dimension to go back to their several historical presentations. I quote, in the analysis carried out on the different configurations of the work, we must also take into account the conditions of its presentation, which are often difficult to reproduce. So it's my translation. And he shows, for instance, how Anthony McCall's notorious line describing a cone, when first shown in the 70s on several occasions, was relying on the smoke of cigarettes that spectators were still allowed to smoke in art spaces. Whereas at some point at the end of the 70s, after a failed screening in a very neat art center in Sweden, where one wasn't allowed to smoke, he had to use smoke machines to give back the work its visibility and corporeality. So there were different variations of the work. An example I could give from my corpus is the screening of the cycle of songs by Stan Brakhage. So it's a series of 8mm films that were shown during these tours. And that was mostly screened in hotel rooms or apartments because of its format. And here I quote P. Adam Sidney, describing screenings in Pula in Yugoslavia. I quote, every afternoon following lunch, I showed a program of the songs in our hotel room. It was always packed, once went with almost 40 reverently perspiring movie stars, directors, beatniks, writers. Remember, this is August with the windows covered by a blanket to kill the light. So somehow the size and the warmth of the work's presentation context was adapted to its format and impacted in return the sweaty reception of the films. Related to the historical life of film copies, focusing on particular film screenings can also help us to construct a historical narrative attuned to differences. So instead of just an homogenizing overview of these traveling exhibitions, I argue that we should look at the variety of contexts where they took place on a micro level and be attuned to the differences in this context and receptions that built new American cinema or il nuovo cinema americano or le jeune cinéma américain, etc., etc. And maybe it's not exactly the same thing. Borrowing Barbara Cassin's notion of the untranslatable that she developed with the dictionary she edited in 2004, Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, dictionnaire des intraduisibles, I suggest to stay with the many instead of aiming at unity. And here there's something to be gained, not only in sort of complexifying the image of New American cinema in the 60s, but also in revealing the network of people that was instrumental in making these screenings happen and also have an impact outside the US. And this leads me to my final proposition, which is that looking at these transnational screenings could help us to approach the affective dimension of such events. And by mentioning the affective dimension, I do not mean that we could go back to the particular feelings of spectators and organizers during screenings in the 60s, because as we all know, feelings are a very fleeting, subjective phenomenon that is hard to grasp, and they are certainly not archived as such. However, testimonies of participants and recollections of their personal reactions to the films should not be left aside. They actually produce for us the knowledge on these events and the possibility for them to be described today. Let me share an example. In his book, Une Renaissance du cinéma, first published in 1985, and that was the first monograph on post-war American avant-garde underground films published in France, film historian Dominique Noguez describes the unfolding of some screenings in Paris that were part of the last traveling exhibition of New American cinema in 1967. So as he explained, the films were screened at the Cinémathèque Française with Henri Langlois changing the order of the films as he pleased and renaming the series Avant-Garde Pop et Beatnik, a naming Noguez suggests might have contributed to the success of the screenings. So I quote, I translated it in English, sorry, it's in French in the PowerPoint. For despite the screening schedule, 6:30 and 10:30 p.m., the screening room at the Pedagogical Museum was almost always full, at least at the beginning of the screenings. P. Adam Sidney, Birded and Aesthetic, ended out the list of films and an introductory text that he had written in French and mimeographed at his own expense. To the spectators who showed interest, he also gave, at the exit, an invitation for a private screening of Brackage's songs in 8mm at the home of a certain Mr. Herbert, Rue du Val-de-Grâce. Some Parisians thus had the privilege of experiencing the charm of lengthy screenings without comfort, on cushions or on the floor, in a sort of vast attic workshop. And you can see here that his book displays a reproduction of the invitation to this private screening of Brackage's songs that, contrarily to other documents reproduced in the book that are mostly credited to anthology film archives, has no credit. This document and the detailed quality of Noguez's description, and especially the last part I read, are put in a new light when one reads more carefully the first page of the introduction of his book. He starts by describing a typical screening of underground cinema in, as you'll see, religious terms, and the epiphany that he personally experienced when discovering them. One, I quote, "One leaves the theater dazzled, weary, reassured, feverish, as the first Christians perhaps left the catacombs." We are in the 60s, and what arouses this fervor is nothing else perhaps than the reinvention of cinema. This book would not exist without this first shock. For us in Paris, it took place in November 67 on the Rue d'Ulm at the Cinémathèque Française for 10 days. So what we understand from this last sentence is that Nogaz, who was 25 in 67, was actually present at the screenings in Paris that he later describes in his book. So we also understand that his description relies on his own memories that he doesn't acknowledge as such. He says "I" in the introduction, but not in the main body of the text. And indeed, 2 or 3 months after the program took place, in February 68, he published a review of the American films in La Nouvelle Revue Française, and here as well he describes not only the films, but the audience, and I quote, "few fanatics who stayed until the end of the screenings, and that we should decorate." So what should be recognized then is the way in which the remaining descriptions of screenings of New American cinema actually produce for us the knowledge on these events and the possibility for them to be described today. In describing remaining descriptions of screenings that were part of the traveling exhibitions, in recognizing the necessarily subjective nature of them, it is thus possible not only to reconstruct New American cinema's plurality of sites in the 60s, but also to construct a dialogue between a plurality of voices that took part in the development and existence of this movement. And I thank you for your attention.
No, fine. Tout petit frisson. Okay, so now we have our second speaker, who is Ronald Gregg from Columbia University, where he teaches film studies. He's a specialist of queer cinema and underground cinema as well. And he will present a paper titled "Without Jerome, the Patronage of Jerome Hill and the Creating of the 1960s American Experimental Work in Europe." And now Ron's file is called Faye, but is it yours? Okay. Okay, and we do this. Okay. Very good.
Thank you, Giaime. And thanks to everyone who has organized this and my co-panelist. Yes, the title of mine is Without Jerome, the Patronage of Jerome Hill and the Curating of 1960s American Experimental Work in Europe. Experimental filmmaker, critic, curator, archivist, and advocate Jonas Mekas acknowledged the importance of filmmaker Jerome Hill's patronage to the New York avant-garde cinema, emphatically stating, and quoting him, "I have to tell you frankly that without Jerome, Film Culture magazine would have closed by 1960. Without Jerome, neither the Filmmakers Cooperative nor the Filmmakers Cinematheque would have survived. Without Jerome, there would have been no anthology film archives." Both Mekas and playwright Jack Gelbart, and Gelbart wrote The Living Theater's first major success, The Connection, labeled Jerome Hill an angel. for his support of the experimental underground, i.e., many artists and entities would never have survived the 1950s and 60s without his financial support. A descendant of the multimillionaire railroad tycoon, James J. Hill, Hill generously used his inherited wealth to fund his own filmmaking and extensively fund those experimental entities that make us list and much, much more. Hill provided direct grants to individual filmmakers such as Stan Brakhage, Gregory Markopoulos, James Broughton, and Mary Ellen Butte, anonymously funded 12 experimental filmmakers a year through 1960 to 1965, including Jack Smith, Peter Kubelka, and George Landau, through the Friends of the New Cinema Fund, administered by Makis. He supported film producer and entrepreneur David Stone, including Stone's production of Adolphus Mekos's Hallelujah the Hills, which was screened the first night of this conference, featuring Jerome Hill as Convict One, and kept alive Judith Molina and Julian Beck's experimental theater company, The Living Theater, and paid the legal bills for Makis and Ken and Flo Jacobs in 1964, who were arrested for screening Jack Smith's experimental film, Flaming Creatures, and charged through the obscenity laws at the time. Importantly for our panel today, Hill also funded and participated in the introduction of American experimental and independent films to Europe in the 1960s, including the Festival of Two Worlds at Spoleto, Italy in 1961, as Faye mentioned. 2 traveling exhibitions of experimental films throughout Europe in 1964 and 1967 into 1968, as Faye mentioned. Organized film screenings of experimental work in Cassis, France, and supported the New American Cinema Group exposition in Torino, Italy in 1967. In his giving, Hill stayed mostly anonymous. Only Makis and a few other individuals knew about the extent of his giving. 2 major reasons for his anonymity stand out. One, as word got out about his generosity, the number of requests for financial assistance from struggling artists greatly increased. To shield himself from these requests, Hill set up the Avon Foundation in the 1960s, formalizing the request process and giving him distance from these requests. He still made the decisions behind the scenes. This later became the Jerome Foundation after his death in 1972, which is still an important source for early career artists. 2, Stan Brakhage relates that Hill was once prevented from exhibiting his paintings in a Paris gallery due to his wealth, since, quoting Brakhage, the gallery claimed that everyone would think that he had bought the gallery show. Similarly, Hill was likely concerned that observers would think that he had bought his way into screening his films in Spoleto, Torino, and other places. There is certainly truth to that concern, since he did promote his own films, and those he supported enthusiastically, such as Makis, included his films in the Spoleto, Torino, and other European screenings. With his training in European art technique, travels extensively throughout Europe his whole life, particularly Paris and Rome, and establishing a summer home in Cassis, France, Hill's taste and own art bridged the European and US art worlds. Given his Eurocentrism, it should come as no surprise that he would instinctively help to organize screenings at Spoleto and other European cities. While his film and artwork is mostly conventional by the more daring experimental work of the day, by the end of Hill's life, the experimental cinema that he had enthusiastically supported financially had influenced the structure and aesthetics of his own filmmaking. I would argue, and in fact, here's an example of one of his later films in the image Death in the Forenoon, 1966, and shows this incredible change of course, kind of coloring a very personal cinema. I would argue that there is another important element that explains Hill's time in Europe and developing interest in experimental film, his homosexuality. Leaving the US for Europe allowed Hill to explore not only his interest in art, but his homosexuality as well, becoming more open and comfortable through the distance that Europe allowed him, particularly from the judgment of his family in St. Paul, Minnesota. Art was not something that a grandson of a railroad tycoon would normally take up. And through his money and connections, he was able to develop close ties to a gay and artistic network in Europe and the US, which assisted him and Makis. Because of his homosexuality, he more than likely found the queerness in the 1960s underground cinema alluring and liberating. In his discussion of Hill's patronage in Hollywood and the culture elite, Peter DeChernay claims that Jerome Hill funded Makis's court battle over flaming creatures because Hill, who was gay himself, saw the film's exuberant, celebratory mishmash of transvestites and androgyny as an important image to champion in the battle over gay rights. While I think this may be overstating Hill's investment in gay rights and Smith's queerness at the time, I suspect there is something to Hill's fascination with a groundbreaking queerness in the avant-garde scene in New York City in the early 60s. Finally, Hill's homosexuality and desire for privacy suggest a major reason for building an estate dedicated to art, transatlantic visitors, and privacy in Cassis, France. Nonetheless, through his family's wealth, Hill was able to foster a Eurocentric perspective on art. Upon graduating from Yale University in the 1920s, Hill left for Europe to study painting, first at the British Academy of Painting in Rome, and then at the Académie Scandinavie in Paris. Starting in 1934, he maintained an apartment in Paris up until World War II, and Hill published the photographic essay Trip to Greece in 1936, which was based upon photographs that documented his travels on a boat around Greece's mainland and islands. And in 1939, he bought his property in Cassis, France, setting up a home that he visited every summer after World War II to paint, swim, and sun, inviting close family members and friends to visit. After leaving Yale, Hill certainly situated himself in the two worlds of Europe and the US, eventually maintaining lodgings in California, New York, and France. In the 1950s and 60s, Hill financially supported and co-programmed a summer Cassis festival, and here you see a theater where a lot of this programming would take place, inviting composers and musicians, organizing film screenings and theatrical productions, and designing promotional posters and theatrical sets for productions. These festivals offered exposure and financial support to European and American theatrical professionals and musicians. American musicians and composers and filmmakers were increasingly a major part of the programming. For instance, in 1958, for the second International Cassis Festival, Hill invited the American composer, Alec Wilder, who was a very close friend of his, to write incidental music for a performance of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which was played by the New York String Quintet. In 1966, the festival screened David Stone and Adolphus Makis's film, Hallelujah the Hills, along with Hill's own films, and featured performances by New York City's The Living Theater. Moreover, his place in Cassis became a resting stop for close filmmaking acquaintances, and you've heard these names that are floating through my paper and Faye's paper and future papers, but Jonas Makis, P. Adam Sidney, David and Barbara Stone, and Taylor Mead, among many others, would stop over and spend time at Cassis with him. This group in particular was actively involved in introducing the new American cinema to Europe. For the 1961 screening of New American films at Spoleto, Hill supported the travel and lodging of David and Barbara Stone, who, working with Jonas Makis, programmed 54 films for the festival. David Stone served as the official representative and wrote the introduction for the program, while the patron Hill designed the main logo that you see here for the festival program cover and posters. Hill also helped promote the film screenings in Spoleto, even hanging the posters, and that's him on the ladder right there, for the film screenings. In the program introduction, Stone asserted that the American filmmakers were breaking new ground through their low-budget films, which explored new subjects, new techniques, experimenting with new forms, and daringly descending into themselves, seeking their own private poetic visions. The program introduced festival goers to what is now considered the groundbreaking, independent, and experimental American cinema of this period, including John Cassavetes' Shadows, Robert Frank and Alfred Leslie's Pull My Daisy, Stan Brackage's Anticipation of the Night, and Jonas Mekas' own Guns of the Trees. While never reaching this canonical status, as I've mentioned, Hill included his own films, including his 1961 film, The Sandcastle, as part of the program. This festival of films would not have happened if it wasn't for Hill's financial support, along with his position on the board of directors of the festival's foundation and his friendship with the gay composer Giancarlo Menotti, who was the founder and director of the Festival of the Two Worlds in Spoleto. The festival's mission was to bring American and European culture into conversation, i.e. the two worlds, similar to what Hill had already been doing in Cassis. In 1964, Hill financed curator and critic P. Adam Sidney's screening tour of experimental films throughout Europe. The tour followed Sidney's screening of American films at the International Film Exhibition at Nacht-le-Zot, Belgium. This was a significant transition year for experimental film, bringing new aspects of experimentation and audaciousness, as illustrated by Sidney's program, which included Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising, Brackage's Window Water Baby Moving, and Gregory Markopoulos's Twice a Man. Also, this new American experimental film screening encountered censorship, most famously through the censorship of Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures. And this also was experienced, Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures experienced censorship in other European cities on Sidney's tour, and of course later in the US, as I've mentioned earlier. This also marks Hill's increased involvement in the underground, impacting his own filmmaking as he experimented with hand-painted effects on film, non-narrative structure, and more personal content in his films Death in the Forenoon, as I mentioned, The Canaries, and his last film, 1972's film Portrait. Space, enthusiastic audience, and disruptive groundbreaking experimentation came together in May 1967 in Torino. Hill brought the various individuals that would organize the 1967 Torino program together through the 1966 Cassis Festival. Italian critic and theater organizer Edoardo Fedini attended the Cassis Festival, and he had earlier on programmed the Living Theater in Torino. And it was geared towards, and he had programmed this in 1965, geared towards revolutionizing theater in Italy. And this is Julian Beck and Judith Molina, who were, basically running the Living Theater. And at Cassis, the Living Theater performed their latest groundbreaking work, Frankenstein, and Fedini attended the performance, later programming Frankenstein for this festival in May 1967 for Torino's Cultural Union. Through Beck and Molina, Fedini met Hill, Mekas, and Taylor Mead, and their conversation led to the planning of the 1967 New American Cinema Group exposition at the Cultural Union in Torino. Thus, in 1967, Torino became a site of disruptive experimentation through both the performances of the Living Theater and the groundbreaking screenings of experimental cinema. The Torino film program ran from May 12th to the 22nd and was a very different cinema than the Spoleto program, illustrating the incredible shift that had occurred in experimental cinema from 1961 to 1967. This revolutionary program introduced what would become a new canon of experimental work, including Warhol's Vinyl, Tony Conrad's The Flicker, Brackage's The Art of Vision, and Ron Rice's Chumlum. And again, you can see a little bit of the program here that is presented by Jonas Mekas and Jerome Hill, this part of the program. Mekas was represented by his film version of the Living Theater's successful production, The Brig, and Hill opened the festival with his short experimental film, Death in the Forenoon, demonstrating again, as I mentioned, the shift in his more personal experimental cinema. The screenings closed out with a roundtable featuring Mekas and Hill and Italian critics and filmmakers. As in 1963, many of the films were taken on the road to other European cities, as Faye and others will talk about here, first by Mekas and then by Sidney. According to Jonas Mekas, and I'm quoting him, in 1967, Jerome paid for another major traveling exposition of the American avant-garde film. P. Adam Sidney and I put together some 25 programs, which I took to Torino, then to Rome, and then P. Adam Sidney took all over Europe, in some countries jointly with Barbara Rubin. For the Torino and Rome shows, Jerome made personal calls and contacts to assure that shows took place in visible, good places, end of quote. Notice again, Jerome's personal contacts and how they paid off in Spoleto, and here also in the expansion of the program out of Torino. Hill was again the angel, and in this case, introducing Europe to Brakhage, Warhol, Conrad, and many others. Along with Makis, Hill was instrumental in laying the groundwork for the influence of American independent and experimental film on European experimental filmmakers. He fostered talent, financed the conversation about experimental film at festivals, and through the journal Film Culture, which he actually wrote for occasionally, particularly on the films of Stan Brakhage, and they had a personal friendship. And he built the institutional structures for the distribution, exhibition, and archiving of avant-garde work in Europe and the US. Jerome Hill was a major part of the bridge that brought American experimental film into Europe, and that bridge still exists. Hill's home and property at Cassis now houses the Carmico Foundation, an international residency program fostering research, creativity, and experimentation for individuals from around the world. Thank you.
Very well. Now I introduce the last paper of this first part of the afternoon. Miguel Fernandez Labayan from the Universidad Carlos III of Madrid and John Sandholm from Stockholm University present. They are working together on a big project, on a continental scale project, researching the presence of American underground cinema in Europe. They are presenting a paper titled "The Western American Experimental Film, 1963." Do you want to sit together?
Yes.
Yeah.
The chair over there.
Okay.
No, I think you're going to talk, so you need to be in front of the
2 mics, right?
Okay, but then,
You
Yes.
sit there and you press the button.
yeah, but the button is on your side.
The button is
But
on
the
your
button is
side.
on
It
my
has a
side.
metaphorical meaning, I think.
Yeah, because I need to watch the slides, so I don't know.
Okay.
So I will know how to.
Okay, I leave you to your, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
power drama.
Okay, good evening. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us. I will not talk, it will be John, so I will just press the, the mouse for you. Hope I do it well. So, John.
Thank you, Miguel. This
Yeah.
is, I mean, the slides that you're going to see, it's 12 slides, a few notes that I've scribbled down. And this is the result of a negotiation between Miguel and me. So we'll see how this performance will go. It's a collaboration. The title of this paper is, as you can see, The Western American Experimental Film, 1963. And the starting point for this presentation on the paper is actually that when we were in the archive of the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm, we found a poster that you can see on the left-hand side called The Western American Experimental. And this was a tour that we have never heard about. It also consisted of films and some filmmakers that we have not heard about. When asking Canyon Cinema about the program, they didn't know anything about the program. They couldn't find a trace of the program in their archive. And also when asking people who are very knowledgeable on the West Coast when it comes to, or who have also researched the history of experimental film on the West Coast, people like Steve Anker, Steve hadn't either heard about the tour. So, of course, we got very interested. Next slide. Okay. So, and why did we dig into this? Well, partly we are, as As you can see, we are following the footsteps of Faye. We have been, since 2 years back, we have been working on a research project that when we pitched it to the Swedish Research Council 3 years ago, it had the following title: The Histories of the New American Cinema Expositions in Europe, 63-64 and 67-68, The Emergence and Diversity of European Experimental Film Cultures. You might wonder why we say 1963. Well, Knocke started, in fact, in 1963 already. That's why we talk about 63-64. And the aim with this project is actually, you could put it in like, I think Faye put it quite nicely. I mean, it's a kind of microhistory of the tour. But the idea is actually to write the history of the New American Cinema Tour from each place where it took place, where it traveled. And in that sense, we are talking about that we are sort of looking at this particular, which you could call space-time configuration that is established in each and every venue. And with space, then we would mean, the different connections between the sites. And this is important because the connections doesn't mean that they were, on a national level. It could be one place that was connected to another place in another country. So, spatial in that sense. And time, meaning here that, of course, when you had, these films, these programs, that in the first place, almost every time the programs were carried out in different ways. There was always ongoing negotiations. Also, when it comes to financing, there were always different financing, local financing schemes, but also in terms of that the organizers always had some idea about, okay, we want to include another film, we want to have this film included, or then due to other circumstances, some films were not being shown. But the real temporal dimension here is, of course, what is the actual context when the program arrives? Because, of course, in certain places, there were already a prehistory of New American cinema. New American cinema films had been shown in that particular place. And through this, by doing this research, we are sort of also then, and this is what we're trying to do, we are also then able to sort of, get an image of how the different local film cultures look like. And of course, this is taking place at a crucial moment because what we can see is an emergence of different European experimental film cultures, but not in any kind of linear sense. You can clearly see that, for example, in 1962, one scene could be very vibrant, and then it had disappeared in 1967. So this is in that sense, it has, every place has its own time-space configuration. And we also, of course, partly, we're also making the same place like Faye, or although we would put it somewhat differently. We also want to make a kind of critical historiography of the tour, and also a critical historiography of experimental film history. And we would claim that very often experimental film history has been written as a kind of affirmative historiography, as a way of strengthening the community. I think it's very much a history of certain very sort of strong figures. And so we were in a way both baffled, but we were also very happy when discovering this poster, because of course then the Western Experimental Film Tour was yet another deviation, and yet another sort of space-time configuration, where again we could see that this tour connected 4 very different places and venues, and we'd also had their own sort of temporal configuration, meaning that some of these venues were very new, some of the venues were very established, which of course also then put different expectations on the tour. You, Miguel, say if you want to add something.
Yeah,
or
no,
okay,
fine.
Okay, good, thank you. So goals, we have 3 kind of goals or aims with this presentation. So partly then, of course, because this has partly to do with that we have found something that we hadn't heard about. So we want to highlight some of the films and filmmakers who have been excluded from the reproduction and circulation of the New American cinema history. Of course, also to map the Western American experimental film tour that we will do for you, and to find out why there are no traces of the Turin film history. So we also will provide you, hopefully, with an answer to that. And this third point is especially interesting because from the point of view of Kenyan cinema, the tour was a success. So here you have an image that shows actually the same, almost the identical program being shown in San Francisco in December 1963, when the films had been shipped back. So because they thought it was such a success, so they wanted to do it, you know, also in the US. Yeah, next slide. So these are the 4 different venues. First, it went to Stockholm. That's the poster that you already saw. The second place was the Danish Film Museum. That's the second image. Yeah. The third is in Vienna. And this was organized by the Film Society at the Technological University in Vienna, that was at the time organized and run by Peter Konlechner, who later, the following year, Peter Konlechner and Peter Kubelka would found the Austrian Film Museum. And then the fourth image is from the fourth place, which is in Berlin. You see it's Freunde der Deutschen Kinemathek, which is better known as Arsenal nowadays. And this was actually, Ulrich Gregor was really the curator, the programmer. And this was actually Gregor's first really big event that they organized. It was the first time that they also actually printed a program folder for the event. So you can see it's 4 very different venues. The Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm had already both shown New American cinema. They had Alfred Leslie had been in Stockholm. They had showed Pull My Daisy. They had showed the Cassavetes film Shadows, Shirley Clarke. And they also curated a lot of short films, independent film, but of course also was very famous for introducing to at least the Scandinavian audience contemporary American art. Another, I think, thing that I need to say is that film was really a sort of a key art form at the Museum of Modern Art at Stockholm, because it's when the museum was founded and started in 1958, it had already had a film society since 1956. And the reason for this was that film was considered to be the most interesting cultural form at the time, and it was also the one that attracted the biggest audience. So this was a conscious idea from the curator Peter Pontus Hultén at the Museum of Modern Art to actually build up an audience for the museum before the museum started. So film had a long tradition. The Danish Film Museum was, of course, a very sort of established traditional cinematheque, one of the most important ones in Europe. The scene in Vienna was a very new kind of sort of film club scene, and the Freunde der Deutschen Kinemathek was also a new venue, but a venue that also really worked according to Ulrich Gregor's interest, and of course he was always interested in film that were challenging in one way or another in a sort of political sense. So it was political cinema that was the thing that he really cared for. Next slide. And here are some of the films and the filmmakers. And you can see several films by Manu Pelli. We tried with Miguel to do a kind of to screen the same program in Berlin last fall, and it was almost impossible to do it. Many of the films have disappeared. Many of the films, there's only one print, which means, of course, that the archive won't allow you to screen it. You see also the very diversity, if you think about what kind of films and what kind of programming. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, and the presence, of course, of Stan Brakhage, who was already an established filmmaker and well known in Europe. as well as several films by Bruce Bailey, who, as we are about to see, was, after all, the organizer of the tour, along with Chick Strand.
We can go to next slide. Sorry. Okay, so this is the first letter, the first way of approaching the Museum of Modern Art when Bruce Bailey wrote to the film studio or the Cine Club at the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm, where he suggests that, or I mean, in the letter he writes that, okay, they have already made a deal with Copenhagen and would Stockholm be interested. This is the beginning of a very interesting correspondence, because they were very knowledgeable about American experimental film in Stockholm. Pontus Hultén, as you might know, he had also made films together with Robert Breer in Paris. And they had showed films, as I said previously, but they knew, except for Brakhage, they knew nothing about these films and filmmakers. And they were, of course, asking, you know, what kind of films we're going to program, and they wanted to suggest some other films. And when Hultén suggested some films that had some kind of connection to the East Coast, at some point Bruce Bailey said that, well, you know, the guys on the East Coast, they tend to be a bit too commercial, implying that the West Coast was the real avant-garde. Finally, then they agreed on the program, and basically Stockholm did screen the films both in the order and according to the sort of program schedule that Bruce Bailey and Chick Strand suggested for the Museum of Modern Art. What is interesting is that in this correspondence, in this exchange, you can see that Bailey is clearly thinking according to, you know, programming. Okay, we want to show a set of films by some filmmakers, whereas Pontus Hultén, who was this producer, curator, of course, as a director of the museum, he understood what sort of curating was, and that was one reason, of course, why he wanted to get more information in order to curate a program that also would then attract an audience, right? So then next slide. So we are making a distinction here between programming and curating, where you can say that programming is what you're doing is making a selection of films to be screened. And this is the kind of very naive approach from Bruce Bailey's and Chick Strand's point of view. Whereas curating is a way of creating a discursive and interpretative apparatus around the selection of films, and also Faye mentioned in her presentation. So from this perspective, it's then interesting to compare Stockholm and Berlin. And that's the next. So Stockholm had shown a program that they called the New American Cinema, New York Film, in March 1962. And the chief curator, film curator at the Moderna Museum, Niels Hugo Geber, had written in an article that was published in Film Culture in 1962, where he described what a success the film program was in 1962. So this was, of course, the local context and the expectations in Stockholm. So they framed the program from Canyon Cinema according to these expectations and this way of approaching what they called in the correspondence the American independent cinema. And then we could take next slide. And Freunde der Deutsche Kinemathek, they chose to insert the program as part of a 7-day-long program that they called Off Hollywood. And that was an introduction to what they called independent cinema. And here you can see on the right-hand side, firstly, a lot of sort of documentary classics, beginning from Assembly Line. And you see Richard Leacock and Lionel Rogozin being, you know, some of the key filmmakers. And Ulrich Gregor also wrote a piece introducing the program. where he also made a distinction between a more sort of, you know, formal aesthetic cinema and the political cinema. And he also included what we could call the early narrative New American cinema as part of this politically oriented or more politically oriented cinema. And as you can see then, the Canyon Cinema program is just inserted as experimental films from the Californian Canyon Cinema. And you could buy a ticket for the whole program at the time. We want to say more?
No.
No. Next.
Yeah. So we're reaching the conclusion.
Yeah, we'll reach our 3 conclusions. So firstly, what we can see is that Canyon Cinema had no organization to curate the program, unlike New American Cinema. I mean, of course, New American Cinema was a way of promoting. And of course, it was not the first attempt. I mean, Creative Film Society already in the 1950s were, you know, contacting Brussels and wanted to make a tour with American experimental film. Danish Film Museum had shown films by the Greifen Group and so on. But what New American Cinema was so good at was, of course, to create this package and also to create a discourse around the package. And so here is the image from Spoleto and the posters being made for each film that we saw, that you showed previously, where we saw Jerome Hill putting up the posters on the wall. Our second conclusion. So the curatorial establishes discourses around the films so they become objects for use. So this again rhymes with very much with Faye's point that she wanted to make, that it's not the films, it's the discourses that we established around the films. And especially one very famous example is the controversy in 1967 in Berlin, where again, and at this time, the tour I mean, many of the screenings in Germany were financed also by the United States Information Service. So they took place at the America Häuser in Germany. And when Ulrich Gregg was offered the program in 1967, he said it was easy, everything was paid for. And then he made a program folder where he also included the very famous critique that Amos Fogel posed against how New American Cinema had developed, and which was published in Evergreen Review. And when P.R.M. Sidney saw this program folder, he told Ulrich Gregg that if you don't allow me to insert a sheet of paper where I explain what an idiotic article this is, I will withdraw all the films and you will have to cancel the program. So this is the sheet of paper that Ulrich and Erika Gregor were forced to put inside every sort of, you know, program folder at Berlin. And after that, they created this program that you see down here, which was made for the next step. I mean, it went to Hamburg. And after that, the same program folder was used for the different venues in Germany. They only made a few changes in the dates and so on. So for example, the same program was used for München or Munich later on, 67. So you could see here also, I mean, how much, of course, they wanted to be in control of the interpretation. And the third conclusion, the curatorial apparatus creates, of course, material and objects for history, out of which then history is to be written. And it's striking, of course, when you look, especially after, from 64 and forward, when you look at the films that are being screened, that it's, I mean, the consistency. The same films are being screened, unlike, again, as we have here in the previous papers. So this is the program that was shown in München or Munich, which was actually the first place after Knocke. Yeah, after Knocke it went to Munich, to München.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much. And are there any questions or comments on these first three papers? Otherwise, we can, don't be shy. You can raise your hand. Yes, Faye. No, no, you have to come here because otherwise they won't. No, you have to come here and talk into the microphone because otherwise the recording. Yes, no, I wasn't kidding. Sometimes I'm not kidding. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes I'm not kidding.
No, it's just an anecdote that somehow can nourish your paper. Is that I also, when I was doing my archival research, I found some of those leaflets for the West Coast program in Europe. And at some point I talked with P. Adam Sidney and I told him, oh, but I saw that actually there was another program that toured before yours. And do you know about it? Did you know about it? Etc. And he was like, no, I don't know, no. And so he didn't, I'm sure he knew. I mean,
of course, Bailey also knew, I mean, when they approached, because as you know, I mean, they had already produced the material for the 64, I mean, the planning and so on.
yeah. So it's just
there was really this one for Europe, like the run company. See that. But I have a question for you.
No, speak into the microphone. Otherwise, our American friends won't.
Faye, I just wanted to ask you about I mean, how you research the affective dimensions beyond this reception in some, in this case, book that you showed us. But if you have developed kind of a further apparatus, if you want to call it, or method of.
Yeah, I'm not sure I developed a method really, but there are like other examples, a bit different maybe than Nogues, for instance, and I'm sure the Italians among us know about that, but there's for instance, this guy named Massimo Bacigalupo, you know him, so was someone who was young at the time who saw those films, was very cinephile and started making films after seeing those films. And there's one film that probably you've seen where there's like film culture in the film. And so it's sort of this network of people that then also start making films after seeing them. And yeah, that's another example.
Okay, more questions? But anyway, we'll have more time at the end of the second part of our panel. So now we can take a break, stop the recording for a while, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you.